Today, it is crumbling and buried in sand. But thousands of years ago, Nippur is a jewel in the desert, with a mystery at its heart. Nippur is one of the richest archaeological sites on Earth. It lies in the center of a war-torn country. Decades of conflict have prevented experts from fully exploring its story.
What if one of the oldest civilizations on Earth did not rise where history says it did, but arrived from a place so thoroughly erased that even its coastline's gone? We are taught to picture the Sumerians stepping out of the mud of southern Mesopotamia as if cities simply bubbled up between the Tigris and Euphrates, brick by brick, temple by temple, as though civilization were a plant that only needed river water and sunlight. Clean story, comfortable story, maybe too comfortable. Because the deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger the beginning looked. First cities in Sumer seemed to burst into focus with unsettling speed. Accounting systems, monumental buildings, canal management, long-distance trade, specialized labor, religious centers large enough to organize thousands of people. Was less like watching a campfire start and more like opening a door and finding the whole room already glowing. Something had happened before the lights came on. Something big. Climate-controlled lab, half a world away from the dust of Iraq. That question narrowed into a sliver of bone no longer than a thumb joint. Came from the dense inner ear region of a skull recovered from a burial near the alluvial south where heat, salt, and time usually chew ancient DNA into useless fragments. Most researchers expected failure. Mesopotamia is a terrible archive for genetic material. DNA there doesn't sleep peacefully. It rots, it leaks, it vanishes. But this sample did not vanish. First sequence came off the machine. It looked wrong. Not wrong in the way of contamination or lab error. Wrong in the way a map feels wrong when the mountain is in the sea. Ancestry profile did not fit neatly into the usual boxes researchers had built from surrounding region. There were signals related to populations known from the northern Fertile Crescent, were links pointing east toward the Zagros. That part made sense. Ancient populations mixed all the time. Tucked inside the data was a pattern that refused to sit still. A ghost signature strongest where no known ancient population was supposed to be standing. That was the first crack. You have to understand how rare that kind of moment is. Ancient DNA is not a magical machine that prints ethnic labels. It's more like listening to a choir after half the singers have left the stage and the rest are humming from another room. Researchers compare fragments, statistical cluster, shared drift, mutation patterns, lineage markers, estimate relationships, not destiny. The science is powerful, but it is careful. Deals in probabilities and kinship web, not mythic announcements. Still, careful science can be explosive when the pattern keeps repeating. A second burial. Similar signal, a third. Then, a fourth sample from a site further north showed the component diluted but still present, as if something from the deep south had flowed upward through later populations like ink in water. First, the team suspected the obvious explanations. Modern contamination, mislabeling, damaged reeds, reran everything. Independent extraction, different clean room, different analyst. Pattern came back like a stubborn echo. Outside the lab, southern Mesopotamia waited in the imagination, exactly as schoolbooks had frozen it. Reeds trembling in the marsh, flat horizons, brown channels splitting the plain, the first cities clinging to riverbanks. During the late Ice Age and the millennia that followed, the world looked very different. Sea levels were lower. Persian Gulf, that glittering body of water we know today, was not always water. For long stretches of prehistory, much of that basin was dry land, a broad low-lying world fed by rivers, springs, wetlands, and seasonal lakes. Lost plain, not Atlantis. Nothing so theatrical, something more unsettling because it is geologically plausible. Real landscape that existed, sustained life, and then drowned as the seas rose. Coarse samples from the Gulf have hinted at ancient river systems beneath the water. Paleoclimate models suggest habitable zones where fresh water would have pooled. Archaeologists have long speculated that human communities may have lived around that basin when the shoreline lay far beyond the modern coast. Small groups, perhaps. Fishers, reed cutters, hunters, early herders, people who knew mudflat, tidal rhythms, bird migrations, and the moods of brackish water, the way a mountain shepherd knows stone. Old assumptions said civilization came from settled farmers mastering land. New possibility whispered something far stranger. What if part of the Sumerian story came from people who mastered water first? That thought changed the room, because once you see it, the clues begin to rearrange themselves. Southern Mesopotamia was never just farmland. It was a watery labyrinth, marshes, inlets, silty islands, reeds taller than a man, fish traps, bitumen-sealed boats, channels that shifted like living veins. People shaped in a drowned Gulf homeland would not have entered that environment as lost migrants. They would have recognized it the way lungs recognize air. You can almost feel the sea dawn over a vanished plain at the edge of the Ice Age, the smell of wet reeds and mineral-rich mud, water birds lifting in white bursts from shallow lagoon, children following adults through sedge and salt grass, learning where fresh water can be found after a storm and where it turns bitter, drying on poles, fish scales flashing silver in woven baskets, reed boats nudging through narrow channels, low and silent. A world of tides, memory, and movement. The sea begins to rise, not in a single apocalyptic wall that would be easy to remember and easy to dramatize. Real catastrophe is often slower and crueler than that. Shorelines creep inland, wetlands become estuaries, camps are moved and moved again, burial grounds vanish, springs go brackish, old roots disappear. Place your grandparents called the center of the world becomes a shoal, then a lagoon, then a depth no one can return from. Year after year, generation after generation, people retreat northward carrying more than tools. They carry habits, craft, water engineering, trade instincts, sacred geography, stories about the sea taking what was once home. Suddenly, the flood myths of Mesopotamia stop looking like random imagination and start feeling like cultural scar tissue. Was the second crack. The team behind the DNA data did not present it that way, not at first. Scientists are trained to fear seductive stories. Seductive stories can ruin good evidence. So they stayed with the language of admixture, source populations, undersampled regions, and hypothetical refugia. Dry words, sensible words, but around those words a dangerous implication gathered. The genetic signal pointed most strongly toward a population once living in or around the exposed Gulf Basin. Then the ancestors of at least some southern Mesopotamians were not simply local farmers who gradually came urban. They may have included descendants of a displaced waterscape culture from a homeland that no longer exists on any map. It should have been enough. It wasn't. The real fight began when other evidence started leaning in the same direction. Isotopic traces from some human remains suggested diets rich in aquatic resources consistent with populations deeply tied to marsh and estuary ecology. Archaeological finds from the broader region showed early and sophisticated use of boat, net, shell, fish, and bitumen technology. Coastal settlements around Arabia hinted at seafaring traditions older than many had assumed. Trade routes linking southern Mesopotamia with distant shores appeared less like late improvisation and more like the visible remains of a much older maritime instinct. The old image of the first city builders hunched over fields had company now. Another figure emerged beside them, wet with spray, hands blackened with bitumen, reading current and wind. Came the twist nobody in the public was ready for. The DNA did not support a simple invasion story, a lost race descending from the sea, not a pure people replacing another pure people. Data suggested convergence. Southern Mesopotamia was not born from one source. It was a delta in human form, a braided meeting place where groups from different ecologies and regions merged. People tied to the river plain, people carrying ancestry related to the Zagros Highlands, and people whose deepest roots may have stretched into the drowned Gulf Basin. Shock was not that the Sumerians came from somewhere else. The shock was that the question itself was too small. Civilization did not come from one place. It condensed. Moisture gathering on cold glass, ideas, people, and survival strategies accumulated where pressure was highest. Rising seas displaced communities. Rivers delivered fertility. Trade stitched distant zones together. Different populations met not in peace all the time, not in harmony, but in necessity. First great cities may have emerged not because one genius culture invented urban life in isolation, but because environmental disruption forced multiple skilled populations into the same unstable corridor, where cooperation became profitable and complexity became unavoidable. Turns the usual story upside down. We like to believe civilization begins in stability. Good soil, predictable rivers, full granaries. What if urban life was accelerated by pressure, by displacement, by people who had already learned how to improvise when landscapes collapsed under them? If the first city was not a monument to comfort, but a machine built by survivors? Think about that for a second. Temple Tower, the canal, the storehouse, the clay tablet, the sealed jar of grain, the counted flock, the labor roster, the boundary stone, the dock. These are often described as signs of order. They are. But they are also tools against chaos, tools against hunger, flood, migration, and mistrust. In that reading, Sumer was not simply humanity growing up, it was humanity cornered into becoming more organized than ever before. The language puzzle added a final shiver. Sumerian has long stood apart. A linguistic isolate with no universally accepted close relative does not prove a drowned homeland, of course. Languages can isolate for many reasons. In the new light, its solitude felt less like an oddity and more like a shadow cast by missing land. Communities from the exposed Gulf Basin had moved north and merged into emerging urban centers. Their speech could have arrived already shaped by a history no surviving shoreline preserved. Map forgot them, the language remembered. Skeptics pushed back hard and fairly. Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia is still sparse. Heat destroys evidence. Underwater archaeology in the Gulf is brutally difficult. Statistical models can be distorted by missing reference populations. Genetic signal from an unsampled region does not automatically mean a spectacular lost homeland. It could reflect complex population structure across Arabia, Iran, and Mesopotamia that we simply have not resolved yet. Science, at its best, is a machine for resisting premature wonder, but wonder kept surviving. One child burial in particular became impossible to ignore. Genome carried the mixed profile seen elsewhere, yet a maternal lineage tied distantly to populations along the Arabian littoral, combined with local ancestry and signs of a community already embedded in the southern plain. Child was not a migrant from a single origin story. That child was the story. The fusion had already happened. Time the earliest cities were rising, the people who would become Sumerian were not assembling, had assembled, and from that fusion came an explosion. Uruk swelled, administrative tablets multiplied. Clay, that humble mud of riverbank, became memory externalized. Marks stood in for sheep, grain, labor, land, obligation. The city learned to count itself. Boats moved goods through watery arteries. Temples organized labor on a scale villages could never sustain. Horizon changed shape. Human beings had lived in groups for hundreds of thousands of years. But something about this southern experiment crossed a threshold. It was as if many older survival skills, each developed in separate worlds, suddenly locked together like gears. Field management from farmers, mobility and aquatic knowledge from marsh and gulf populations, herding connections from adjacent uplands, trade habits from coastal exchange, administrative pressure from growing density, climate stress, religious authority, ambition, fear, and raw invention. And the result is not a village that gets bigger. It is a new organism. You can hear it if you listen closely enough. The slap of water against a dock at dawn, scrape of a reed stylus on wet clay, goats coughing in a pen, hammering on a timber frame, someone shouting tallies across a courtyard, fish oil, smoke, sweat, river mud drying on bare feet, incense lifting above a shrine. A city being born not from silence but from many older worlds colliding in one place. Here is the hardest part of the whole revelation. If this interpretation is right, then one of the foundational chapters of civilization begins with refugees from climate change, metaphorical refugees, actual displaced communities adapting to rising seas. Past reaches forward at moments like that and grabs you by the shirt. Tend to place ancient people behind glass, safely finished, their dramas reduced to museum captions. The Sumerian beginning seen through this lens becomes terrifyingly modern. Lost coast, forced migration, hybrid identities. New technologies born from instability, political systems hardening under environmental stress, memory turning disaster into myth. First urban age may have emerged from pressures that sound uncomfortably familiar. This is why the DNA mattered so much. It did not merely hint that the Sumerians might have roots in a place nobody expected. It suggested that nobody expected because the place itself had been deleted, drowned, buried under the Persian Gulf, a homeland swallowed so completely that later civilizations sailed over it without knowing they were crossing the floor of an ancestral world. Yet the partial resolution is not the end. It rarely in science. Genetic study can resurrect a shoreline by itself. No single burial can tell the whole truth. Strongest version of the idea still waits for harder proof. More genomes from southern Mesopotamia, older remains from Arabia, sediment coring that pinpoints ancient habitable zone, and, if luck ever turns generous, an underwater site in the Gulf with preserved human material. One harbor, one berry, one cluster of artifacts in sealed sediments could move this from provocative hypothesis to historic upheaval. Till then, the ancient dead remain frustratingly eloquent and infuriatingly incomplete. Maybe that is fitting. Sumerians gave the world some of its earliest writing, but their own deepest prehistory may still lie in a silence beneath warm green water, hidden under shipping lanes, oil routes, and modern coastlines. First city builders may have carried the memory of a drowned world into the mud of Mesopotamia, turned loss into organization, and transformed displacement into civilization. So, then the oldest urban heartbeat we can hear began with footsteps retreating from a rising sea. That lost plane is still down there. If buried channels and forgotten camps really sleep beneath the Gulf, then one of the greatest archaeological discoveries on Earth is not in a desert tomb or under a palace mound. Hotter it is underwater, waiting in the dark where history never thought to keep looking. So the next time someone tells you civilization began in the obvious place, ask them a harder question. Obvious to whom? The map we inherit is not the world ancient people knew. Coastlines move, rivers wander, seas erase. Past is not a textbook. It is a crime scene with half the evidence missing. If you want more stories where science rips open the neat version of history, subscribe and stay close. Because the next mystery might be even stranger. What if the first kings were not rulers of land at all, but heirs to sailors who never stopped searching for the coast they lost?